The rain didn't fall. It assaulted. Each drop was a tiny, cold fist hammering the slick black asphalt of the city street. It hammered on the roof of the limousine, a frantic, useless drumming against the sound-proofed interior where Alistair Croft was losing his mind. "I don't care what you have to do. Find it," he snarled into his phone, his voice a low, dangerous thing that had made markets tremble and grown men flinch. "Turn the car around. Retrace every single step. Every curb, every puddle. Do you understand me, Jonathan? Every single puddle." He didn't wait for an answer, snapping the phone shut with a click that echoed the finality of a guillotine. He raked a hand through his perfectly silvered hair, his knuckles white. It wasn't the money. The cash in the wallet was a pittance, less than he spent on wine in a week. It wasn't the platinum cards. They could be canceled and replaced with a single call. It was the small, worn photograph tucked into the faded leather sleeve behind the driver's license. A photograph that no amount of money on earth could ever replace. His knuckles were bone white as he gripped the armrest, his jaw clenched so tight a muscle spasmed in his cheek. He stared out at the relentless, gray misery of the city blurring past, but he didn't see it. He saw only her face, smiling, her eyes full of a light he had spent the last decade trying to forget and failing miserably. He felt a familiar, cold dread coiling in his stomach, a feeling he hadn't experienced since he was a boy, with nothing but holes in his pockets. The feeling of being utterly, terrifyingly powerless. The wallet was gone, and with it, the last tangible piece of his soul. The same rain, the one that was merely an inconvenience to the insulated world of Alistair Croft, was a personal adversary to Lily. It seeped through the worn thin soles of her shoes, tiny, icy trickles that made her toes curl. It plastered her thin brown hair to her scalp and dripped from the tip of her nose. But worst of all, it soaked the frayed hem of her dress, making the faded blue fabric cling to her skinny legs, heavy and cold. The dress was her favorite, even with the tear, especially with the tear. It was a long, jagged rip in the seam of the skirt, a casualty of a misjudged climb over Mrs. Gable's fence to retrieve a runaway ball. Her grandmother, Elena, had promised to mend it, her nimble fingers still capable of magic with a needle and thread. But her arthritis had been bad this week, her knuckles swollen and sore. So the tear remained, a small flapping mouth that seemed to drink in the rain with a thirsty desperation. Lily clutched a small brown paper bag to her chest, protecting its precious contents, a loaf of day-old bread and a small carton of milk, the entirety of their dinner, from the downpour. She navigated the sidewalk with the practiced agility of a small creature accustomed to the city's unforgiving landscape, her eyes scanning the ground ahead. It was a habit born of necessity. People in this part of the city dropped things, coins mostly, sometimes a glove or a cheap earring, once a whole, uneaten apple. Finding a penny was a small victory. Finding a quarter was a cause for celebration, a tiny spark of warmth on a day like today. Her gaze, sharp and focused, swept over the dark, glistening pavement, past discarded newspapers turning to gray pulp and the rainbow sheen of oil in a puddle. And then she saw it. Tucked against the curb, half submerged in a flowing gutter, was a rectangle of dark leather. It was fat and swollen with rain, but it was unmistakably a wallet. Her heart gave a little flutter, a mix of excitement and fear. She glanced around. The street was mostly deserted, just a few hurried figures huddled under umbrellas, their faces obscured. No one was looking for anything. No one seemed to have noticed. Hesitantly, she crouched down, her worn dress dipping into the cold, gritty water. Her small fingers, red and numb, fumbled with the slick leather. It was heavy, heavier than any wallet she had ever imagined. With a final nervous glance around, she pulled it from the water, tucked it under the paper bag against her small chest, and began to run. The slap, slap, slap of her soaked shoes echoed on the pavement, a frantic rhythm that matched the pounding of her own little heart. Their apartment was small, just 2 rooms at the top of a creaking 4-story walk-up. It smelled of lavender and old books and the damp that was a constant, unwelcome resident in the walls. Elena was sitting in her worn armchair by the window, a thick woolen shawl wrapped around her shoulders, her gaze lost in the rain-streaked glass. She turned as Lily burst in, a small, dripping whirlwind of energy and excitement. "Goodness, child, you look like a drowned rat," Elena said, her voice warm and raspy, like old velvet. But her eyes, though clouded with age, were sharp, and they immediately noticed the frantic energy radiating from her granddaughter. "What is it, Lilybug? You look like you've seen a ghost." Lily placed the grocery bag on the small, wobbly table, and then, with a dramatic flourish that belied her nervousness, she presented the wallet. "I found it, Grandma," she whispered, her voice full of awe, "on the street, in a puddle." Elena took the wallet. Her hands, gnarled and stiff with arthritis, moved with a slow, deliberate grace. She laid it on the small crocheted doily on the table beside her chair, and opened it carefully. The leather squelched softly. Inside, the contents were damp but largely intact. A thick wedge of $100 bills, more money than Lily had ever seen in one place. A row of shiny plastic cards, gold and platinum and black. And tucked into a special flap, behind a cloudy piece of plastic, was a driver's license. The man in the picture was handsome in a severe sort of way, with silver hair and eyes that seemed to stare right through the plastic, cold and assessing. Alistair Croft. The name was printed in stark block letters. Elena's breath caught in her throat. She knew that name. Everyone in the city knew that name. He owned half of it, it seemed. Towers of glass and steel bore his name. Philanthropic galas were held in his honor, and his face was a regular feature in the business section of the newspaper, always with the same unsmiling, powerful expression as the one on the license. And then, as she carefully separated the damp contents to let them air out, she found the photograph. It was old and creased, the colors faded, the edges soft with time. It showed a woman with a radiant smile and eyes that crinkled at the corners, holding the hand of a small boy who looked no older than Lily. The woman looked so full of life, so vibrant, that it was hard to believe the photograph was just paper and ink. Elena looked from the photo to the severe face on the license. There was a story here, a deep and painful one. She could feel it. "Well," she said softly, her voice heavy with a significance Lily couldn't quite grasp. "This is a bit more than a lost quarter, isn't it?" She looked at Lily, whose eyes were wide and fixed on the pile of money. "What were you thinking, little one, when you picked this up?" Lily's gaze shifted from the money to her grandmother's face. I thought someone must be very sad that they lost it," she said simply. And I saw the picture." She pointed a small, damp finger at the photo of the woman and the little boy. He looked sad without his mommy. Elena's heart ached with a fierce protective love. This child, Her child, who had so little, whose own dress was torn because they couldn't afford a new one, saw not the money, but the sadness. She saw the heart of the matter. "You are right, Lilybug," Elena said, her voice thick with emotion. "Someone is very, very sad right now, and we know his name. We must do the right thing." Alistair Croft was not a man accustomed to waiting. He paced the length of his penthouse office, a cage of glass and chrome, suspended 50 stories above the city he owned. The rain had stopped, leaving behind a world washed clean and glittering under the emerging city lights. But the storm inside him still raged. Jonathan had called back, his voice tight with failure. They had retraced the route twice. They had questioned a dozen doormen. Nothing. The wallet had vanished, as if swallowed by the city itself. He slammed his fist on his vast, empty mahogany desk. The sound was sharp, violent, but it did nothing to silence the frantic screaming in his own head. He felt stripped bare, vulnerable. That photograph was his penance, his private shrine. It was a picture of his wife, Amelia, and their son, Thomas, taken a week before the accident. Amelia with her laughter that could fill a room, and her belief in the inherent goodness of people. A belief he had once shared and had long since discarded as a childish fantasy. And Thomas, his little boy, with his serious eyes and his quiet curiosity. The wallet had been a gift from her for their first anniversary, the leather still smelling new and full of promise. He had carried it every day for 25 years. After she was gone, it became a tomb, a relic. The money, the cards, they were just insulation. The real treasure, the thing that anchored him to the man he used to be, was that faded photograph. Without it, he was just Alistair Croft, the billionaire, a hollow name attached to a portfolio of assets. He walked to the floor-to-ceiling window and stared down at the river of headlights flowing through the city's arteries. So many people, so many lives, insignificant and interchangeable. Someone down there had his wallet. A thief, most likely. Someone who would toss the photos and the memories into the nearest trash can without a second thought. Their only concern, the cash and the credit limits. A bitter, cynical smile twisted his lips. It was what he would expect. The world was a transactional place. Kindness was a currency for fools. You take what you can get. He had built his empire on that very principle. And now, the world was simply applying his own rules back to him. The irony was as cold and sharp as the glass against his forehead. The next morning dawned bright and deceptively cheerful. The city steamed gently in the early sun, the air scrubbed clean by the storm. After a meager breakfast of the day-old bread, toasted and shared, Elena and Lily set out on their mission. Elena had spent a restless night, her arthritic joints aching, her mind churning. The address on Alistair Croft's license was for his corporate headquarters, the towering Croft Tower that pierced the skyline like a shard of black glass. It was a world away from their small, crumbling neighborhood. She dressed Lily in her second-best dress, a pale yellow one with a small, neatly darned patch on the sleeve. She brushed Lily's hair until it shone, tying it back with a faded ribbon. She wanted her granddaughter to look respectable, to not be judged before she even spoke. She placed the now dry wallet, its contents carefully replaced, into a clean, empty cookie tin. "For safe keeping," she said. The journey downtown was an adventure in itself. They took 2 buses, the rumbling vehicles carrying them through neighborhoods that grew progressively cleaner, wealthier, and more intimidating. The people were different here. Their clothes were crisp, their faces set with purpose, their strides long and confident. No one met their eyes. When they finally stood before Croft Tower, Lily had to crane her neck back so far she felt a little dizzy. It was like a mountain made of mirrors, reflecting the sky and the clouds and making them seem small and insignificant in comparison. The lobby was a cavern of gleaming marble and hushed reverence. A waterfall cascaded down one entire wall, the sound a gentle, constant shush that seemed to absorb all other noise. Men and women in sharp suits moved with a silent, frictionless efficiency. A security guard, broad and impassive, stood by a bank of futuristic elevators. He looked at Elena and Lily, his gaze lingering for a fraction of a second too long. A flicker of something that might have been suspicion, or just mild curiosity at their presence in this temple of wealth. Elena, holding Lily's hand tightly, walked with a quiet dignity that had seen her through 70 years of hardship to the large, curved reception desk. The woman behind it was impossibly elegant, with hair sculpted into a perfect chignon, and a smile that was polite but held no warmth. "May I help you?" she asked, her voice as smooth and cool as the marble around them. "We are here to see Mr. Alistair Croft," Elena said, her own voice steady, though her heart was thumping against her ribs. The receptionist's smile tightened infinitesimally. "Do you have an appointment?" "No," Elena admitted, "but we have something that belongs to him, something he lost." She gestured to the cookie tin Lily was clutching with both hands. The receptionist's eyes flickered down to the tin, then back up to Elena's worn coat and Lily's patched dress. A look of carefully veiled condescension settled on her features. "I see. Mr. Croft is a very busy man. I can't possibly interrupt him without an appointment. Perhaps you can leave, whatever it is, with me." "No," Elena said, her voice firm now. "It is a personal item. It must be returned to him directly." The receptionist's patience was clearly wearing thin. "I'm afraid that's not possible. If you leave your name, I can." She was interrupted by a commotion from the elevators. A side door opened and Alistair Croft himself strode into the lobby, trailed by two assistants who were talking rapidly, holding out tablets and documents. He was a whirlwind of tense, frustrated energy. He wasn't listening to them. His eyes were dark with sleeplessness, his face a mask of grim preoccupation. He was heading straight for the main entrance, about to plunge back into his frantic, fruitless search. "Mr. Croft!" Elena called out, her voice stronger than she expected. He didn't hear her, or chose not to. He was almost at the revolving doors. "Wait!" It was Lily's voice this time, high and clear, cutting through the hushed ambiance of the lobby. The sound was so unexpected, so out of place, that it made Alistair stop. He turned, his brow furrowed in annoyance. His cold, assessing gaze swept past Elena and landed on the small girl standing beside her. He took in her patched dress, her cheap, scuffed shoes, and the faded ribbon in her hair. His eyes narrowed, and then, with a dismissive cruelty, they flickered to the prominent, jagged tear in the skirt of her other dress, the one she'd worn yesterday and was now carrying in a bag for her grandmother to mend. He didn't see a child. He saw a symbol of the poverty he despised, the grasping neediness he had spent his life escaping. A sneer, ugly and unconscious, twisted the corner of his mouth. "What is it?" he snapped, his voice sharp with impatience. "Is this bring your disadvantaged child to work day? Some of us are trying to run a global enterprise here. If you're looking for a handout, you're in the wrong lobby." Try the shelter down on 5th. The receptionist gasped softly. The assistants froze. The security guard shifted his weight. The cruelty of the remark hung in the air, sharp and poisonous. Elena's face paled, and she pulled Lily closer, a protective arm wrapping around her small shoulders. But Lily didn't flinch. She just stood there, her wide, honest eyes fixed on the powerful, angry man in front of her. She had heard cruel words before. They were a part of her world, like the cold and the rain. She held out the cookie tin. "This isn't a handout," she said, her voice small but unwavering. "You dropped this." Alistair stared at the tin, as if it were a strange, alien object. He looked from the tin to the girl's earnest face, and a flicker of confusion crossed his features. "What are you talking about?" he demanded. With trembling fingers, Lily lifted the lid of the tin. There, nestled on a clean paper napkin, was his wallet. The world seemed to stop. The sound of the waterfall, the distant city hum, the frantic monologue in Alistair's own head, it all went silent. He stared at the worn leather, at the familiar shape of it, and a wave of disbelief, so profound, it was dizzying, washed over him. He looked at the girl, really looked at her for the first time. He saw the stubborn set of her small jaw, the unwavering clarity in her brown eyes. He saw the tear in the dress she clutched, the one he had just mocked, and saw it not as a sign of poverty, but as a testament to a life lived with so little. And yet, here she was, returning a wallet that contained enough money to buy 100 new dresses, maybe 1,000. His own words echoed back at him, vile and shameful. "If you're looking for a handout." He had taken his own fear, his own ugly cynicism, and thrown it at this child like a stone. A deep, burning flush crept up his neck, a feeling of shame so acute it was physically painful. He felt as though the marble floor might crack open and swallow him whole. He reached out a hand, his fingers unsteady, and took the wallet from the tin. His thumb automatically went to the familiar clasp, and he opened it. The bills were there, the cards were there. He fumbled with the flap, his heart pounding a sick, heavy rhythm against his ribs. And there it was, the faded photograph of Amelia and Thomas, safe, dry, unharmed. He stared at it, at the smiling face of the woman who had believed in the best of him, and felt a chasm of self-loathing open up inside him. What would she think of the man he had become? The man who would mock a child's poverty? He slowly raised his eyes from the photograph to meet Lily's gaze. The entire, vast, marble lobby seemed to shrink until it contained only the two of them. The billionaire who had everything and had lost his soul, and the little girl in the torn dress who had nothing and had just handed it back to him. He started, but his voice was a dry, cracking sound. He had to clear his throat. Thank you." The words were inadequate, flimsy things, utterly incapable of conveying the tectonic shift that was occurring inside him. He looked at the girl's grandmother, at the quiet, weary dignity in her face, and saw not judgment, but a deep, sorrowful understanding. And that was somehow worse. It was a mirror reflecting his own monstrous behavior. He had not just been cruel, he had been wrong. Wrong in a fundamental, soul-deep way he hadn't even known was possible anymore. The foundation of his world, the cynical, transactional principles upon which he had built his entire life, had just been shattered by a small girl with a tear in her dress. The silence that followed was heavy and profound. Alistair's assistants stood frozen, unsure of what to do. The receptionist stared at her computer screen, pretending to be absorbed in her work. The security guard suddenly found a spot on the ceiling to be of immense interest. It was as if they all collectively understood that they had witnessed something intensely private, a moment of reckoning that had cracked the formidable facade of Alistair Croft. Alistair finally broke the spell. He took a deep, shuddering breath, the air feeling thick and hard to draw into his lungs. He crouched down, an unfamiliar and slightly awkward movement for him, until he was at eye level with Lily. The expensive fabric of his trousers creased on the cold marble floor. "What's your name?" he asked, his voice softer now, stripped of its earlier arrogance. "Lily," she whispered, her gaze dropping to the floor for the first time. She was suddenly intimidated by this man's proximity, by the intensity of his stare. "Lily," he repeated the name as if tasting it. "That's a beautiful name." He looked at the torn dress again, the one she had carried for her grandmother to fix, and the shame washed over him in another sickening wave. He reached into his wallet and pulled out the thick stack of $100 bills. He tried to press them into her small hand. "Please," he said, his voice thick with a desperation that surprised him. "Take this. For a new dress. For 100 new dresses. For whatever you want." Lily shrank back, her hand closing into a small fist at her side. She looked at her grandmother. Elena gave a small, almost imperceptible shake of her head. "No, thank you," Lily said, her voice quiet but firm. "Grandma says we don't take rewards for doing what's right. It's just what you're supposed to do." The simple, unassailable logic of her words was another blow. He was trying to transact his way out of his guilt, to pave over his boorishness with cash, just as he always did. But this child, this family, they operated under a different set of rules. A code of conduct he had long forgotten existed. He felt his eyes sting, an unfamiliar and unwelcome sensation. He stood up slowly, the joints in his knees protesting. He looked at Elena, his gaze pleading. "Please," he said, his voice raw, "allow me to do something. Anything." Elena studied his face. She saw the turmoil there, the genuine remorse warring with a lifetime of ingrained habits. She saw a man who was profoundly lost. "The child did what she was raised to do, Mr. Croft," she said, her voice calm and measured. "Her honesty is not for sale." She paused, then added, "But a cup of tea would be nice." It was a long journey here. The request was so simple, so unexpected, that it completely disarmed him. Not a demand for money, not a threat of a lawsuit for his verbal abuse, not a play for a reward. A cup of tea. He stared at her, then a short, sharp, incredulous laugh escaped his lips. It was a rusty, unused sound. "A cup of tea," he repeated. He turned to his stunned assistants. "Jonathan, clear my schedule for the rest of the day." "But, sir," Jonathan began, "you have the quarterly review with the board at noon, and the call with the Tokyo Consortium at—" "Clear it," Alistair repeated, his voice leaving no room for argument. He turned back to Elena and Lily. "I have a kitchen upstairs that has an excellent selection of teas, and, I believe, some cookies that are not in a tin." He offered his arm to Elena, a gesture of old-world courtesy that felt both foreign and right. After a moment's hesitation, she rested her small, gnarled hand on his sleeve. And so, the unlikely trio, the billionaire, the elderly woman, and the little girl in the patched dress, walked across the silent, gleaming marble lobby and into Alistair Croft's private elevator, leaving behind a wake of bewildered employees and the lingering ghost of a truly terrible mistake. The penthouse was a testament to minimalist wealth. It was vast, sterile, and silent, with panoramic views of the city that made the world below seem like a toy. The furniture was sparse and architectural, the colors muted shades of gray and white. There were no photographs, no clutter, no signs of a life actually lived. It was less a home than a monument to success. Alastair led them to a small, secluded seating area with chairs that were more art than furniture. He felt a strange unease in his own space, seeing it through their eyes. He suddenly noticed the coldness of the marble, the impersonal nature of the art on the walls. It was a beautiful prison. He disappeared into a sleek, stainless steel kitchen and returned a few minutes later with a tray. It held a silver teapot, delicate porcelain cups, and a plate of exquisite bakery-made pastries. His hands, which could sign billion-dollar deals without a tremor, were not quite steady as he poured the tea. They sat in a slightly awkward silence for a few moments, the only sounds the clink of porcelain and the distant sigh of the city. Lily, perched on the edge of a vast white sofa, looked tiny and out of place, but she tackled a chocolate eclair with a focused determination that was both endearing and heartbreaking. Alistair watched her, a knot tightening in his chest. This child probably considered such a treat a rare luxury. He had a private chef who could conjure such things at a moment's notice, and he rarely partook. "Where do you live?" Alastair asked, breaking the silence. Elena described their small apartment, their neighborhood, without any embellishment or plea for sympathy. She spoke of the leaky roof, the drafty windows, and the 5 flights of stairs as simple facts of her life, not as complaints. "And your parents, Lily?" Alastair asked gently. Lily's face clouded over for a moment. "My mommy is in heaven," she said, her voice matter of fact. "She got sick. My daddy, he went away a long time ago, before I can remember." "I'm very sorry," Alastair said, and the words felt real, not just a polite platitude. He knew what it was to lose someone, to have that gaping hole in the fabric of your life that never truly mended. He glanced at the wallet, which he had placed on the table between them, like a sacred object. He reached for it, opened it, and carefully took out the faded photograph. He handed it to Elena. "My wife, Amelia," he said, his voice thick, "and my son, Thomas. It was taken a long time ago." Elena looked at the photograph, her gaze soft with empathy. "She has kind eyes," she said. "Yes, Alice." He swallowed. "Yes, she did. She would have liked you. Both of you." He looked at Lily. "She would have been appalled at my behavior this morning." He said it without excuse, a flat statement of fact. "She always saw the good in people. I seem to have lost that ability." "Sometimes people get lost," Elena said quietly, her eyes full of a wisdom that went far beyond balance sheets and stock prices. "The important thing is finding the way back." They talked for over an hour. Alastair found himself speaking about things he hadn't voiced in years. He spoke of Amelia, of her laughter and her charity work, her gentle frustration with his obsession with work. He spoke of Thomas, a quiet, sensitive boy who preferred books to boardrooms. He didn't speak of the accident directly, but the grief was a palpable presence in the room, a shadow that clung to his words. In turn, Elena spoke of her life, of raising her daughter alone, and now her granddaughter. She spoke of the community in her neighborhood, the small kindnesses exchanged between people who had little else to give. She painted a picture of a life that was hard, yes, but also rich, in ways Alistair was only just beginning to comprehend. His world was one of contracts and competitors, of acquisitions and leverage. Hers was one of shared meals, borrowed cups of sugar, and looking out for one another. Through it all, Lily sat mostly quiet, listening with a child's solemn intensity, occasionally offering a simple, profound observation that would cut straight to the heart of the matter. When Alistair mentioned a ruthless business competitor, Lily asked, "Isn't it better to have a friend?" When he spoke of his lonely, cavernous house, she said, "Our apartment is small, so Grandma is never far away." Each innocent statement was a small, sharp pinprick to the bubble of his isolated existence. Finally, Elena looked at the clock on the wall, a featureless disk of black glass. "We must be going," she said. "Thank you for the tea, Mr. Croft. It was very kind of you." "Alistair," he corrected her. "Please call me Alistair." He stood up, a sense of panic rising in him. He didn't want them to leave. Their presence had brought a warmth and a humanity to this sterile space that it had never known. It felt as though if they walked out the door, the cold and the silence would rush back in, more oppressive than ever. "Let me drive you home," he said, the words coming out in a rush. "My driver is downstairs. It's the least I can do." Elena started to protest, but Alistair was insistent. He would not allow them to take 2 buses home. He needed to do this, to perform this small act of service. It felt like a vital first step on a long road he couldn't yet see the end of. As they rode the silent elevator back down to the lobby, Lily reached out and slipped her small hand into his. His own hand was large and calloused from years of gripping pens and shaking hands and, metaphorically, wringing the necks of his competitors. Her hand was tiny, soft, and trusting. He curled his fingers around hers, a connection so simple and yet so powerful that it sent a jolt through his entire being. It was a feeling of pure, uncalculated human contact, a feeling he realized he had been starving for. When they emerged into the lobby, the atmosphere was thick with curiosity. Every eye was on the strange sight of the formidable Alistair Croft, holding the hand of a little girl in a patched dress, escorting her and her elderly grandmother toward the main entrance. He didn't care. For the first time in a very long time, he was completely indifferent to what other people thought of him. He was focused only on the small hand in his, and the quiet, unassuming woman at his side who had, with a simple cup of tea, shown him just how bankrupt he truly was. The ride to Lily's neighborhood was a journey through different worlds. The sleek, silent limousine slid from the gleaming canyons of downtown into older, grittier streets. The buildings were shorter, made of brick and stone instead of glass and steel. The storefronts were for laundromats and corner bodegas, not designer boutiques. Alistair watched the city change through the tinted windows, but his attention was mostly inside the car. Lily was fascinated by the buttons and lights, her nose pressed against the glass, her breath fogging a small patch of the window. Elena sat with her quiet composure, her hands folded in her lap. "Here," she said finally, pointing to a 4-story brick building with a crumbling facade and a fire escape zigzagging down its front. "This is us." The driver pulled the limousine to the curb. It looked like a spaceship that had landed on a foreign planet. People on the sidewalk stopped and stared, their expressions a mixture of curiosity and suspicion. Alistair got out and opened the door for Elena and Lily. As he stepped onto their street, he felt a profound sense of dislocation. The air smelled different here, a mix of exhaust fumes and cooking spices. The sounds were different. The distant wail of a siren, the chatter of people on their stoops, the beat of music from an open window. It was messy, chaotic, and vibrantly alive. "Thank you for the ride, Alistair," Elena said, giving him a small, genuine smile. It was quite the treat. They started to walk towards the entrance of their building, but Alistair followed them. He couldn't just leave them here. Not yet. "The roof," he said, looking up at the stained and weathered cornice. "You said it leaks?" "When the rain is heavy," Elena confirmed. "We have a bucket. It has character." Alistair looked at the steep flight of stone steps leading up to the front door. "And the stairs. 5 flights, you said." "Good for the heart," Elena said with a wry twinkle in her eye. But Alistair saw the slight wince as she placed her foot on the first step. He saw the way she subtly favored her right hip. He looked at Lily, at her thin dress and her scuffed shoes. He thought of his own home, with its private elevator and its climate control, and its staff of people paid to ensure his every comfort. The contrast was a physical blow. "This won't do," he said, more to himself than to them. "This won't do at all." He turned to face Elena. His mind, so adept at solving complex financial problems and orchestrating hostile takeovers, now focused on a single, clear objective. "I own several apartment buildings in the city, newer ones, with elevators, and very reliable roofs. I have a vacancy in a very nice one, just a few miles from here. It's a 2-bedroom. It's yours, for as long as you want it. No rent." Elena's smile faded. She looked at him, her expression serious. "Alistair, we talked about this. We don't take rewards." "This is not a reward," he insisted, his voice gaining urgency. "This is an apology. This is a restitution for my behavior, for everything. Please don't deny me this. I need to do this." He saw the hesitation in her eyes, the proud resistance to accepting charity. "Think of Lily," he pressed, playing his only card. "Think of her not having to climb 5 flights of stairs every day. Think of her being warm and dry when it rains." Elena's gaze softened as she looked at her granddaughter. She saw the hope in Lily's eyes, the unspoken wish for something better. She knew that her own pride was a luxury she couldn't afford if it came at the expense of Lily's well-being. She sighed, a long, slow release of breath. "1 year," she said, her voice firm. "We will accept your offer for 1 year, as a loan. After that, we will pay you rent, what we can afford." Alistair opened his mouth to argue, to say that it was unnecessary, that money was no object. But he saw the look in her eyes, and knew that to argue would be to insult her dignity. Her integrity was not something he could buy, and he had to respect the terms. "Agreed," he said, feeling a surge of relief so powerful it almost made him lightheaded. 1 year. That afternoon, Alistair did something he hadn't done in decades. He personally supervised a move. He dispatched his own team, not a moving company, but the quiet, efficient men who handled the transport of priceless art and sensitive documents for his corporation. They descended on the small apartment, their movements careful and respectful under Alistair's watchful eye. He stood in the small, cramped living room, surrounded by the humble artifacts of a life lived with love but not with money. The worn armchair, the collection of chipped porcelain birds on the mantelpiece, the framed hand-stitched sampler that read, "Home is where the heart is." He watched as the movers carefully wrapped Elena's old books and Lily's small collection of toys. He saw the bag with the torn dress and instructed one of the men to handle it as if it were couture. He felt a strange sense of reverence for these simple possessions. They had a history, a soul, that was absent in his own curated, designer-filled world. By evening, they were installed in the new apartment. It was clean, bright, and spacious, with large windows that looked out over a small park. The kitchen had new appliances. The heat worked with the quiet hum of efficiency. There was an elevator. Alistair had also taken the liberty of having the refrigerator and pantry stocked with enough food for a month. He showed Lily her new room, which was twice the size of her old one. Her eyes were wide with wonder. She walked to the window and looked down at the green trees in the park below. "There's a swing set," she whispered in awe. Alistair's throat felt tight. "Yes," he said, "there is." As he was about to leave, Elena stopped him at the door. "You are a good man, Alistair Croft," she said. "You just forgot for a while." "I had a good teacher today," he replied, his gaze flickering to Lily, who was already running back to the window to look at the swings again. He drove back to his penthouse that night through the glittering, indifferent city. But something had changed. The city lights seemed less harsh, more like a promise. The silence in his vast apartment felt different, too. It was no longer the silence of emptiness, but the silence of contemplation. He sat in the dark for a long time, the worn leather wallet on the table in front of him. He didn't need to look at the photograph. For the first time in a very long time, he could close his eyes and see Amelia's smiling face clearly in his mind. And he didn't feel the familiar, sharp stab of grief and guilt. He felt a quiet sense of peace. He felt that, after a decade of being lost in a wilderness of his own making, he had finally been pointed in the direction of home. The little girl in the torn dress had been his compass. The weeks that followed were a period of profound and unsettling change for Alistair. His life, once a rigid, predictable schedule of meetings, calls, and financial reports, was now punctuated by unexpected moments of genuine human connection. He found himself making excuses to visit the new apartment. At first, it was under the guise of ensuring everything was satisfactory. He would bring by a new lamp or a set of thicker towels, using the material objects as a pretext for what he really wanted: to spend time in their warm, welcoming presence. Elena would always insist he stay for a cup of tea, and they would talk. She had an uncanny ability to see through his corporate armor, to ask the simple questions that forced him to confront the man he had become. "Did you close the deal you were worried about?" she might ask. And when he'd nod, a flicker of his old pride showing, she'd follow it with, "And did it make you happy?" The question would always stop him short. He was successful. He was powerful. He was respected and feared. But happy. The word felt alien, like a language he had forgotten how to speak. The real draw, however, was Lily. She treated him not as a billionaire, a figure of immense power, but simply as Alistair, her new and slightly awkward friend. She showed him her drawings, colorful, imaginative creations that filled pages with smiling suns and fantastical creatures. She read him stories from her favorite books, her small finger tracing the words as she sounded them out. She took him to the park and showed him how to swing properly, insisting that he had to pump his legs to go higher. He felt foolish at first, a man in $1,000 suit sitting on a child's swing. But as he leaned back and pushed off, the simple, rhythmic motion was surprisingly liberating. The world rushed back and forth, and for a few moments the weight of his empire seemed to lift from his shoulders. He was just a man on a swing, with a little girl laughing beside him. These visits became the anchor points of his week. He started to delegate more at the office. He empowered his senior executives to make decisions he once would have micromanaged. Jonathan, his long-suffering assistant, was both bewildered and relieved. "The Tokyo Consortium called again, sir," Jonathan said one afternoon. "They're ready to accept our terms." A month ago, this news would have been the triumphant climax of his week. He would have felt a surge of predatory glee. Now, he just felt a mild sense of satisfaction. "Good," he said. "Finalize the paperwork." He was already looking at the clock. He had promised Lily he would help her with her science project, a model of the solar system. He had commissioned his company's top design team to create a set of perfectly scaled, 3D printed planets, but Lily had rejected them. "That's cheating," she had said, her small face serious. "We have to make them ourselves." So they had spent the previous evening surrounded by styrofoam balls, paint, and glitter, a glorious, chaotic mess on the floor of the new apartment's living room. Alistair, who had orchestrated the construction of skyscrapers, found himself completely inept at painting a reasonably round Jupiter. His hands were clumsy with the small brushes, and he got more paint on himself than on the planet. Lily, on the other hand, was a meticulous artist, her tongue sticking out in concentration as she carefully painted Saturn's rings. In that moment, covered in yellow paint and glitter, laughing as Elena swept up their mess around them, Alistair had felt a pure, uncomplicated joy that no billion-dollar acquisition had ever given him. His transformation did not go unnoticed. The business world began to buzz with rumors. Alistair Croft was softening. He passed on a particularly ruthless but profitable hostile takeover bid, something the old Alistair would have pursued with relentless zeal. He started a new charitable foundation, not just a tax shelter, but a genuinely ambitious project aimed at funding after-school programs in underserved neighborhoods. He endowed it with a significant portion of his personal fortune and, more surprisingly, his personal time. He attended board meetings, visited community centers, and spoke with the people running the programs. He was learning to listen. One evening, he was having dinner with Elena and Lily, a simple meal of roasted chicken and vegetables that Elena had cooked. It was more delicious than anything he had eaten at the city's finest Michelin-starred restaurants. He found himself telling them about his own son Thomas. He hadn't spoken about him to anyone in years. "He was a lot like you, Lily," he said, his voice soft. "He loved books, and he was always asking why. He wanted to be a teacher." There was a heavy silence. Alistair had always been ashamed of Thomas's ambition. He had seen it as a weakness, a lack of the killer instinct required to take over the Croft empire. He had pushed his son, tried to mold him into a copy of himself, and in doing so had created a chasm between them, a chasm that was never bridged. "Why didn't he become a teacher?" Lily asked, her large, curious eyes fixed on him. "Because I didn't let him," Alistair said, the admission tasting like ash in his mouth. "I told him it was a waste of his potential. I told him he had a duty to the family business. We had a terrible fight. He left. He was driving angry. It was raining. He didn't need to say the rest. The story hung in the air, a tragedy of pride and misunderstanding. Elena reached across the table and placed her hand over his. Her touch was warm and comforting. "You can't change the past, Alistair," she said gently, "but you can honor his memory. You can help other children find their potential." A tear traced a path down Alistair's cheek. He didn't bother to wipe it away. It was a clean, honest grief, unburdened for the first time by the crushing weight of guilt. He saw the path forward. The foundation, the community centers, helping children like Lily. It wasn't just charity. It was a penance. It was a way to build the legacy Thomas should have had. A legacy of nurturing potential, not just acquiring assets. Later that night, as he was leaving, Lily gave him a hug. It was a fierce, spontaneous embrace that caught him by surprise. She pressed a piece of paper into his hand. "This is for you," she said. He opened it in the car. It was one of her drawings. It depicted 3 stick figures holding hands under a brightly shining sun. One was large and wore a suit. One was smaller and had gray hair. The smallest one was in the middle, wearing a dress. A blue dress with a small, jagged tear in the skirt that had been lovingly, carefully colored in. Underneath, in a child's wobbly script, she had written, "My favorite people." Alistair leaned his head back against the soft leather of the seat, the drawing clutched in his hand. The limousine slid through the glittering streets of the city he owned, but his world was no longer defined by the towers of steel and glass. It was defined by the warmth of a small apartment, the wisdom of an old woman, and the unconditional love of a little girl who had found his wallet, and in doing so, had helped him find himself. He was finally, truly, on his way home. This was just the beginning of his redemption, a long and arduous process of unlearning a lifetime of cold, hard calculus and replacing it with the simple, profound arithmetic of human kindness. The journey ahead was uncertain, but for the first time in a decade, he was not afraid of where it might lead. He was no longer just Alistair Croft, the billionaire. He was Alistair, and that was more than enough. The tear in the dress, the one he had mocked, had become a symbol of his own tattered soul. And Lily's act of returning his wallet had been the first stitch, the beginning of a painstaking, beautiful repair.